meditation. Just a sec. Okay. Now we've gone through all this. First of all, permanent part, this independent self, I hope was clear. And then the sense of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. So from a Buddhist perspective, on page 2, in the last passage, it says, from a Buddhist perspective, a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, or self, also described as a substantially existent self in the sense of being self-sufficient, is impossible. Because no such owner of the five aggregates, truly possessing, controlling, and utilizing them can be found. Nor is it possible to separate the self from one's own or our own aggregates and transfer it to another, for a person's identity is inseparable from their own mind and body. Similarly, it's impossible to identify or understand the self apart from mind and body. Therefore, Buddhist philosophers assert the absence or lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. As mentioned above, realizing this absence is considered more difficult than realizing the lack of a permanent, partless, independent self. Okay, so those two selflessnesses are hopefully clear. But the subtlest type of selflessness is the lack of inherent existence. Unlike the lack of a permanent, partless, independent self and the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, it is not only more difficult to comprehend, but also applies not just to the self, but to all phenomena. So the lack of inherent existence, that's sometimes called selflessness, when it's applied to a person, it's described selflessness of person. When it's applied to something other than person, it's described as selflessness of phenomena. And I may have mentioned it before, that weird categorization, self and everything else, seems so random first. Selflessness of person versus selflessness of anything else that is not person. Why person and everything else? But of course, because it's our self-obsession, our self-centeredness, that the self takes on a different, or the person takes on a special significance. It's considered to be more important. Watch out for that one kind of idea. But of course, everything lacks inherent existence. Nothing exists beyond being just labeled, right? Therefore, in other words, neither the I nor anything else can be found when subjected to ultimate analysis. And therefore, nothing exists inherently, objectively, or beyond being merely labeled or designated in dependence on its basis of designation and a conceptual consciousness. Okay? So in that way, in that last part, I mentioned lack of inherent existence. I was tempted to also describe that, but then I thought, well, there wasn't enough time anyway. It was 10:30 when I finished this first part. So I thought, okay, we've already discussed it in much detail. There's no need to write it again. But hopefully the first two types are clear. And I do now think, because of one of your questions, so it's also like a pea in a jar, the first type of the self-sufficient. Maybe it makes it clearer if I said like a pea in the jar. But of course, one of the distinctions is that in the second case, the self doesn't have to be permanent and partless, or is not considered to be that. Okay, so that is what you find in the texts when it comes to the different levels of selflessness. And once again, it's not like there are no other views of how the self exists, especially those intellectually acquired ones. There are so many different ways to look at coming up with ideas how the self exists in every cultural kind of, what do you call it, group. You could probably find another interpretation. I don't know, especially now with modern psychology. The child within. You have an adult and a child in there, kind of two. It really comes down to that, like the child within. It's kind of interesting, which are really like our mental consciousnesses that are less mature, that still require some work. So they could be on the level of a child. I mean, sometimes we are like children, totally like children. Why didn't you call me? Right? That kind of like, why didn't you let me play with you? You know, it's like that kind of, it seems pretty childish, but we have these thoughts, of course. All right, great. Now, having done all this, and hopefully having also understood that there is this extreme version and the more moderate or realistic version of every emotion we have. So there's nothing wrong with emotions, but there are the measured ones and there are the extreme ones. And the extreme ones are the ones to look out for. And not even every extreme one is harmful. For instance, grief is an extreme kind of sadness, but it's actually not harmful as such. In fact, if you don't get in touch with your own grief, you may actually suffer from not really dealing with the death of a person, for instance. Of course, grief only arises because we have afflictions, but that doesn't mean we need to now work without grief. No, don't worry about grief, in other words. Even fear, it depends on what we are afraid of. Fear in itself, if we're afraid of the afflictions, that's a good thing. And again, totally exaggerated fear that we can no longer breathe, okay, that's an extreme version, yeah, in this case. But usually fear is like with regret. It depends what you regret. It can be virtuous or non-virtuous. Fearing meditation or fearing virtuous actions, well then you could say, well, that could be pretty negative, actually. Yeah, so it depends on what we're afraid of. Okay, anyway, I think that's enough. And I think hopefully it also makes sense that our extreme views, the harmful views in particular, they keep us from really having love and compassion for others, even for ourselves. If there's attachment for ourselves, we don't have compassion for our failure. We may hate ourselves because we're attached to our success. If then we fail, we react with self-hatred. Whereas real love and acceptance of who we are means we also accept our shortcomings without hating ourselves, but rather using them to make improvements. Yeah. Again, very measured, very sensible, in accordance with reality, not exaggerated, versus I'm going from thinking I'm more important than everyone else and my success therefore is true, and hating myself for failure. And committing suicide because I hate myself, for instance. And again, that self-preservation, you know, like sometimes people, of course, commit suicide for different reasons, and it's terrible that they take that choice or they make that choice. It's really, of course, it's not saying, oh, it's their fault that they're so, no, but it's oftentimes they cannot deal with failure, can't forgive themselves failure. And it doesn't come out of a measured kind of like, I'm okay, I can fail, it's okay to fail. So that means you really love yourself with all your faults. Yeah, that's really important. So that's self-love versus feeling I have to be better and have to put so much pressure on myself. Yeah, so first of all, love and compassion for ourselves. I have the right to fail. I have the right to take a break. I have the right to be happy and being, you know, everything we say about others, we first need to do ourselves. And as I said, at some point, this is not emphasized this much in this tradition, because I don't think Tibetans in the past or up till now really had an issue with that. Self-hatred just wasn't part of who they were. Of course, things are changing, and they're definitely different for us, which is why there needs to be more emphasis on compassion and love towards ourselves. Allowing ourselves to have mistakes, allowing ourselves to not be perfect, right? Not doing everything in the perfect way, to forgive ourselves so that we don't have guilt, to move on. Okay, stuff happened to me, it was terrible, but I'm no longer that person. Okay, I can use it in a positive way, maybe to help others who found themselves in a similar situation. And again, once I've generated love and compassion for myself, now for others as well. And trying to see also how life is for them. One thing that's someone, sometimes it's just little things people tell you and you go, I remember in the beginning when I said, oh, I felt like discriminated against and I felt it was so difficult to be a woman. And I'm not saying that it wasn't. It was kind of, I felt it was hard. I was not used to this. I came from a different culture where many of the things I heard were unacceptable. And people still think that way. So I was really shocked and very uncomfortable. And I wasn't happy. And so one day I complained to one of my classmates. They seemed so happy and everything, they were such good friends and they had the people from their countries, coming and they had friends to hang out with. And then one day I complained. I said, it's so difficult in being a woman. And he listened very, very patiently. And then he said, you don't think we have problems? And I was like, oh yeah, very likely. No, he didn't say it in any mean way. He said, look, we also have problems. Not yours, but ours just feel as bad. So, and I was like, oh yeah, ugh, idiot. It was almost like I was the only one having a problem. My classmates were so happy and then I realized, of course, everyone has problems. Whoever we see, it's always like the grass is greener on the other side. That is such a good saying. Such a good saying. It's also very tempting for when you practice the Dharma to feel like you're in one place and your mind is so difficult, let's change somewhere else. But you always take your mind with you. So it's like it's not going to make a difference. And I know quite a few people who keep changing rooms, going to this, then they stay there for some time and then they switch and then they switch. It can be very good to just have, learn more, have more experiences. But when it becomes an escapism, like, oh, here I'm having problems. These problems have to do with the place, not with my own mind. Sometimes it's really the place. And of course, there's no way you can grow. That's different. But when we're constantly moving, it's like, are we always moving to the wrong place? Or is there something wrong in our own mind? And we should rather deal with the mind because we take that mind with us. So we need to ask ourselves, because it's very tiring to move all the time and go here and there and everywhere. Grass is always greener on the other side. It always seems like, oh, this may be a little better. I'm actually thinking of someone particular, like she keeps moving all the time, moving the whole time. And then so it's initially the problems she had in the first place are not there, but then they arise again. Which is very interesting because like when you go to a different place, initially certain problems are not there, but they'll come back. That's why I think people in the West are so obsessive about their vacations, taking a 2-week vacation, because in that place, somewhere on the beach, that problem is not there. But if they were to stay longer, it would sooner or later arise. But it's enough for them to get like some time away. But Germans are so obsessive about their vacation. And I'm looking at Indians, like here in McLeodganj, and they have not been on a vacation. I've never seen their shops closed. Maybe they were away for a wedding once or twice, but not like this obsessive 3 weeks every year. And they're a lot more relaxed than many Germans that I know that take, their whole family to some other country to lie on the beach and make sure you get skin cancer when you grow old. No, the last part I'm kidding. I think people are careful, but anyway. You want to say something? No. You want to say something?
So it goes back, I think I shared this quote earlier, you don't need to see different things, you need to see things differently. My brother reminded me on that before I came on this trip, because I definitely am a culprit of the grass is always greener. I think just by luck, it kind of has been with the job decisions I made and jumps, I've gotten lucky. But I think I'm like, oh, I need to travel, I'll find myself, and it's like, here coming to India really does seem that this is seeing this and these incredible people and the teachings of the Dharma. Seeing this new different thing is allowing me to see things differently. But it's such a good reminder, right? It's all in here and this is what you travel with.
But I'm not saying it's not a good idea to do some travels, because sometimes if people tell you, it's not going to do it. You need to find it out for yourself. So I'm not saying you shouldn't travel. That's not about, traveling is good, for some time. sometimes people get stuck and their whole life is just, traveling from one place, and that's of course a problem. But it's more like you have a problem in one place and then you move on, believing if you move to a different place, the problem won't be there. That's when it's unrealistic. But I don't think there's anything wrong. Like even in Tibet, many students of the Dharma traveled from teacher to get different teachings and expand their knowledge. But it wasn't about escaping. That's the difference, yeah. Okay, therefore, everything we learned so far, we should see how it's all interconnected. Every topic connects to every other topic. There's not a single topic that does not connect to everything else. I don't know whether I succeeded in giving you at least that impression, how everything is interrelated. I did address quite a few concepts and hopefully made some kind of connection to everything else. But my main goal is, of course, to connect the understanding of reality with compassion, with deep compassion. So again, seeing if we move away from just I, me, and mine, we can actually see others' perspectives better, look at it from their perspective, understand them, and naturally have a feeling of closeness. And that's just healthy. That's just healthy. It makes us feel better. It makes them feel better. So in that way, in all our interaction with other people, and I'm sure there's still room for improvement, but that's why with monks and nuns, they live in communities, and it's not easy. These communities are not communities where you choose people you've been friends with since you were very little. There's only one thing you have in common, which is your interest in the Dharma. Oftentimes you get to live with people you would ordinarily not choose to live with. You would possibly avoid. But that is where the challenge comes in. That's even more difficult, to put yourself into their shoes, try to see their point of view, respect them. Yeah, so this respect, I really like that. So compassion is also a regard and a respect for sentient beings. Especially this feeling of closeness, seeing them as endearing, goes together with a regard, like a respect and esteem. Respect not for their negative qualities, but for their human qualities and for their right to be happy, even if sometimes they are difficult. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we judge them before we judge our reaction. We see the faults in others much faster. So it's like, oh, they're not patient. Oh, they're not considerate. But if they're not considerate and it bothers me, I'm certainly not considerate for their habits, and I'm certainly not patient. It's so much easier to point the finger at others. And again, there's so much to learn. This is all part of our learning process. Initially we go, but then, but how could I change my attitude and make the problem disappear? Because if they don't act in a certain way and it bothers me, I won't be able to make them change. Instead, I could just change my attitude. Going back to what Shantideva says, you can't cover the entire world with leather to avoid thorns kind of bothering or injuring your feet, but you can just take a piece of leather and put it underneath your feet. That would have the same effect as covering the entire world with leather. So basically, we can't change the world, but we can change our attitude, and then it is as if we change the world. They're no longer jerks around because our attitude is such of respect and don't need different people see things differently. Don't need for people to be different. You need to see them differently. You can apply the same saying. You don't need to see more different things. You could say, we don't need other people to be different. We just need to see them differently. You can apply the same to other people.
I think one of my favorite quotes from His Holiness is basically throws a little shade at Western psychology, where he's it's like kindergarten, right? And I think that's one of the ones where he goes, Western psychology is like kindergarten, and that's been so crisp listening to you and learning about the Dharma, that a lot of the ways that we confront all of it
No, I was going to say, I mean, some of it is incredible. Western psychology can deal with problems in a very specific way, where in Buddhism it's more general. But I agree, there are some parts, of course, there's definitely room for improvement, yeah.
Well, even the child's work she was talking about, which is exploratory, it's reinforcing the I. Now, it might be helpful in trauma and other things, but at the end of the day, it's still reinforcing the significance of that same I, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. But I'm a huge fan of Western psychology, and so I'm looking forward to bringing Buddhism and many of these ideas, but some adjustments can be made. I think even Buddhism, sometimes the way it's presented, it's sometimes like, I've used different vocabulary, I've used relatively little terminology. I feel there's still some room for improvement in that, presenting some of these ideas in a way that we can grasp easier. It's sometimes so technical, and people report back to me many times, oh, I learned this, but it still seems to be abstract over there, nothing to do with me personally. And I find that is really sad, and there's room for improvement, I think. Yeah. This is making kind of a sound. Can you hear the sound? Yeah. First I thought it was outside, but now it's stopped, of course. Ah, great, thank you. All right, thank you very much, lovely. I was thinking to do now the meditation. I prepared a slightly longer meditation on emptiness. Is that okay? Should we do that? So the meditation we're going to do here now, it's not about perceiving the self to be permanent, partless, and so forth, not perceiving it as an owner, like kind of like making it, giving it certain characteristics. It's rather about finding something. There's something there that is not body and mind, that is not just labeled, that's the self, right? Without having a strong sense of it. So I will ask you initially, the first step, I will just ask you to become aware of it. We'll start off with it. Just become aware of it. So just to know what you're to expect. So yeah, how does it feel? How that the self? Feel it in your body. Feel it in your mind, which is the object of negation here. And here we're not focusing on the inherent existence of this building or a table. I could have brought that in as well, but the same applies to everything. Therefore, let's focus on the self. So first is identifying what we're trying to negate. And then saying if the I really existed in the way in which it appears, well, either it would be identical with mind and body or separate from it. That's the usual way, the usual approach. And we try both possibilities. We really explore it, not just thinking, no, couldn't be and move on, but dig into it, dive into it if you like. So I'll do all this. Okay, it's separate from mind and body, identical with mind and body. The self is the collection of mind and body. What's wrong with that? And then basically coming to a conclusion. And I want to ask you at the very end to single-pointedly experience just that not finding of that self, not finding it. Again, on an emotional level, if you can. But then I would also like you to, okay, so there are more points to it. Let's see how far we can get, and maybe, I don't want to stress it too much. So we do the first part, but then I also want you to move towards how the self exists. And if it takes too much time, we'll take a break and go back to the meditation, or maybe do it tomorrow. But let's start at least. Okay, great. So we start again. Focusing on the breath. Now take a moment to reflect on how the I or self appears to you. Does it seem to exist merely through the power of thought? Or does it appear more concretely, that is independently of thought? Are there moments when this sense of self feels especially strong? For instance, when you feel embarrassed, when you're wrongly accused of something you haven't done. Or when you accomplish something extraordinary and feel proud of yourself. Doesn't it seem as if the mind is thinking I, because there is a findable, inherently existent self, rather than there being a self only because there's the thought I? And doesn't the I sometimes exist or appear to exist in relation to the body? Sometimes in relation to the mind? And at times in connection with your feeling, your emotions. But then, doesn't it sometimes also seem to be separate from the five aggregates? And at times, doesn't it seem to be located somewhere in the body? Perhaps in the head or in the region of the heart, the center of the chest. In short, doesn't the self appear as if it could be found among mind and body, if only we looked long and carefully enough? Yet if the I really existed inherently in the way it appears to our mind, it would have to be either identical with its parts, namely identical with the body and mind, or entirely separate from them. These are the only two logical possibilities. If the I were entirely separate from its parts, it would have to be observable as something completely different from both body and mind. That is findable, even if the body and mind were removed. But in that case, it would make no sense to think I'm sick when the body is ill, or I'm walking when our legs are moving us from one place to the next. Likewise, it would be illogical to say I'm meditating when the mind is doing so, or I'm bored when the mind experiences boredom. The self were truly separate. Such activities and experiences could not be attributed to the I. They would be entirely disconnected from it. In addition, the I would have to be permanent or static, because all change is associated with either the body or the mind. There's no transformation that pertains to the I or the self alone. if the self were separate from mind and body, it wouldn't have any definable characteristics, as it would be disconnected from the psychophysical aggregates, and none of their attributes, none of the attributes of mind and body would belong to the I. Given that every observable quality of a person is in some way tied to body or mind, it would follow that the I has no characteristic at all. So since all of this contradicts both reasoning and experience, it's untenable, illogical to assert that the self exists separate from the body and mind. The other possibility would be that the I were identical with body and mind. But then the self, the body and the mind would have to be utterly and completely one and the same. The I would be entirely identical with each part of the body, the limbs, skin, blood, bones, and so on. The I would also be identical with every individual consciousness, whether sense or mental consciousness. This would lead to the contradiction that since the parts of the body and mind are many, the I would also have to be multiple. In other words, there would be many selves or many I's. Alternatively, if the self were a single entity, then all of its parts would likewise have to be singular or one, which is clearly not the case. Moreover, it would not make sense to say my body or my mind, because that would imply that the body and mind belong to the I and are therefore distinct or different from it. We may, of course, think that the self is identical with the collection of all of its parts. But this too doesn't make sense. As before, it would mean that saying my body or my mind makes no sense. Because such expressions imply that the I is different from its parts and therefore cannot be one with all of them. Likewise, it would follow that saying I'm sick when our stomach feels ill is illogical, because for the I, as the collection of all parts, to be sick, every part of the body and every part of the mind would have to be sick. It would also not make sense to perceive the self or think about it without simultaneously perceiving or thinking about the entire collection of its parts, and thus about every part of body and mind. So the I, as it appears to us, an inherently existent entity that is not merely labeled on body or mind, but exists from his own side, does not exist. This means that the concrete self we usually worry about, fear for, want to be liked and successful, and go to great length to protect, simply isn't there. There is no truly existent self whose pleasure, gain, praise, popularity or success we need to obsess over. Likewise, there is no inherently existent I that we must desperately shield from suffering, loss, criticism, dislike, or failure. In short, the very self we cling to, strive to protect and gratify at all costs, and perceive as inherently separate from everyone else, is nowhere to be found when searching for it. So before we continue to analyze how the I exists, try to rest your focused attention single-pointedly on the experience of not finding the I for a few moments, allowing the clarity of that recognition to deepen and gently settle into your awareness. not finding the self with ultimate analysis doesn't mean it doesn't exist conventionally. Having negated the way in which it does not exist, we must now identify the way in which it does. For although the self does not exist objectively, from its own side, it nevertheless exists as a functioning entity dependent on causes and conditions, parts, and conceptual designation. It is this I that creates karmic actions, experiences harm and benefit, and will eventually attain liberation and enlightenment. So to understand how it exists, we must reflect on its dependent arising. I is dependent on its causes and conditions. As it is the result of our karmic actions, predispositions, and tendencies from previous lives. It is also conditioned by the influences of both nature and nurture in this life. So dependent on our DNA and our upbringing and experiences in this life. Likewise, it is dependent on its countless parts. Its physical components such as the brain, sense faculties, stomach, limbs, internal organs, skin, cells, and so on. is equally dependent on its various mental aspects. Sense consciousnesses, conceptual minds, attachment, aversion, misconceptions, and other mental afflictions. As well as love, compassion, patience, interests, preferences, and so forth. Most profoundly, the self is dependent on mere designation or labeling. Dependence on mind or body, that are its bases of designation. And the conceptual mind, the thinking mind that applies conventions such as I, the self is merely labeled. So when our legs walk, we think, I walk. When our hand waves, we think, I wave. When our mind meditates, we think, I meditate. And when the mind experiences joy, we think, I'm happy. Similarly, in dependence on our parents, we think, I'm a son, or I'm a daughter. In dependence on siblings, or the absence thereof, we think, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, or I'm an only child. In this way, our self, or more precisely, our sense of identity, arises through a succession of conceptual minds. That in dependence on other things, continuously thinks, I'm this, I'm that, I like this, I don't like that, and so on. Therefore, despite the I appearing to exist from its own side, findable, it does not exist beyond being merely labeled in these various ways. So now, having reflected in this way, try to elicit a positive emotion that arises from your analysis. For instance, a sense of amazement upon understanding that the I, as it appears to us, cannot actually be found. Or perhaps a feeling of relief that we no longer need to obsess over something that doesn't exist in the way it appears. We might even sense a quiet spaciousness, a subtle freedom that comes from loosening the grip of self-clinging. Whatever the emotion, let it arise naturally and simply rest in that feeling. Sustain the emotion by keeping your attention single-pointedly focused, allowing it to permeate the awareness. Wow, you guys are getting really better. I can see when people move because I keep my eyes open, but I didn't see much movement, very, very little. Well done. That was really long, wasn't it? I thought to stop and I thought, no, don't have enough time to do it tomorrow, let's do it. Pardon? It doesn't feel so long. It was pretty long. It was the longest we did so far. We started, so it was 40 minutes, yeah. Yes. Yeah. It was 40 minutes.
Only 3 hours and 20 minutes more to do the
I wrote this meditation down actually some time ago. I'll send that to you if you're interested to do it on your own. Many of the meditations we did before I did off my head, and it was probably confusing sometimes, but this I thought through a little bit. So together with the material yesterday, that what you got in the form of a photocopy, if you want to carry it with you, I can put it in one document, and then you could do this meditation again on your own. All right, great. So have a lovely evening, and the discussion. Is there discussion tonight? Yeah. Oh, the dedication, yes, absolutely. But first, let's do the discussion. Okay. What do you want to discuss? Maybe tonight, let's just keep it open. Let's see how it runs, right? Just anything. Now we covered everything. Just allow it to run, yeah, its own course. Okay. And then lastly, of course, let's dedicate. Whatever positive potential we've accumulated, so that it may become a powerful cause in the future, ripening in the form of gaining a true understanding, a direct experience of how the self really exists, so that we can overcome our self-centeredness and other afflictions, and in their place develop true love, unconditional love, and impartial compassion for all sentient beings, to eventually overcome all that is not in the nature of our mind and actualize our fullest potential for the benefit of every living being. So with this in mind, let's recite the prayer. May the precious bodhicitta arise, if not yet born. When generated, may it never diminish, but increase more and more. May the realization of emptiness arise, if not yet born. When generated, may it never diminish, but increase more and more. All right, have a lovely evening, and see you again tomorrow morning for our last session. That goes, I think, until 10:30. Yeah, that would make it manageable for those who have to leave as well.